Good evening. Welcome to my build analysis solution using Power BI presentation. My name is Abraham Risby. So, in early January 2024, the Kenya Retail Company collected 3 days worth of data and wanted it formed into a database. Now, upon creation of this database, the database team put together a series of requirements for a revamped version of the database that they had just created. Now, keep in mind that the original database had some of the data that was needed, uh, but obviously it required connections to the rest of the tables that were in that database. And all in all, the first database just simply wasn't complete. Now, with that in mind, another database was created. And after that database was created, the responsibility of creating a series of charts and visualizations to accompany this new database fell onto a third party. I am part of that third party. Now, furthermore, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be presenting the visualizations that will accompany the new database that will be turned into the database team of the Canyon Retail Company. In addition to that, I would like to present these to you, my manager, before presenting them to the Canyon Retail Company to ensure their validity and simply work out the kinks. Now, as you can see, this first visualization is the units sold by the Canyon Retail Company, sorted by product name. Now, as you can see, the Cozy Sock product at the top of this chart sold the very most by a relatively large margin, and Biggie Tent sold the least by also a relatively large margin. Now, something that I think is worth noting about this chart is that there are three products that sold the exact same amount within the amount of data that we were provided with, and two products also sold the exact same. Those three products that sold the exact same amount or had a tie per se were the medium tent, the ZZ Z bag, and the Duraboot. Now the next chart we're going to look at is units sold by year. Now, as you can see, there's only one bar in this chart, and that's because we not only got 1 year worth of data, we didn't even get a month's worth of data. We were provided with 3 days in early January's worth of data. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that with this 3 days worth of data, it's easy to use it to extrapolate. And if 43 products sold on over 3 days is a relatively high number of sales, it's important to capitalize on that and key in on what metrics, right? What region or what regions sold the most, what vendors, what stores, everything, every as many data points as possible, right? To key in on what made those 3 days sell 43 units, as opposed to any other part of the year where you might sell more or less units on any given 3 days out of the year. Now, further, you can take this even further, and if you have maybe January 1st through 3rd of 2022 or 2023, you could use this data to extrapolate and draw hypotheses about what made you sell more or less in January 1st through 3rd of 2024 as opposed to any other year, and anticipate what sales might look like in January of 2025. This next chart is the units sold by store region name. The two regions that the database had was the Chicagoland and the tri-state area. What's interesting about this visualization is that the Chicagoland and tri-state area, had the same amount of sales over the given days. They both had the same number of sales or units sold at 43. Now, what that tells me is that expansion into other regions like the West Coast, the Southwest, things like that might be beneficial for the Canyon Retail Company because of the success that they've had in not only the Chicagoland but also the tri-state area simultaneously. obviously keeping in mind that this is only 3 days worth of data, it's important to identify whether or not this trend is the same throughout the year and throughout even the month of January, and what it's been like for the past few years. So what I might implore Canyon retail companies to do is to key in on what metrics led to a sum of 43 units sold in the Chicagoland and tri-state area over these 3 days, and pin down what would it take to make them more successful in other parts of the country if expansion is on their list of goals. Now, these visualizations identify the units sold by region name side by side with the units sold by vendor name. As you can see, the Mountain King vendor had a lot more success than the Pacific Gear vendor, while at the same time, the Chicagoland and tri-state area had an equal amount of success. And what that tells me is that the Mountain King vendor is more prone to having more success regardless of region. And the Pacific Gear vendor is also less likely to, or is, how do I say this, is likely to be less successful than the Mountain King vendor regardless of region. Because as you can see, both regions sold the same number of units. Now, with that in mind, I think it would be wise for the Canyon retail company to consider moving forward with the Mountain King vendor much more proactively, and maybe pursuing the Pacific Gear vendor strictly in a limited capacity, as long as the Mountain King vendor keeps selling at much more effective and much higher rates than the Pacific Gear vendor. Now, these are some of the visualizations. As you can see, we've seen the visualizations that I provided to the Canyon Retail Company's database team. What you see before you now is the calendar table that I've created for the Canyon Retail Company. And what this provides to the Canyon Retail Company is columns like date, month, year, month number, January through December, 1 through 12, week number by month, or week number in general, weekday number, and workday. Now, this table could be used for a wide variety of tasks that are included but not limited to highlighting tasks slated for specific dates, specific week numbers out of the year if a meeting is scheduled for the first week of January annually, or maybe the second week out of any month ever, right? Then this could be used to track those dates. Additionally, in the case of Canyon Retail Operations, or Canyon Retail Company, where I think it might support them with the most success, is in using this table for identifying when they had the most sales. And that could be used by vendor, by region, by customer, by store, however they'd want to use it, and pinpoint those sales and look at them in chronological order, i.e., if they're having better sales on the last 2 weeks of December, it's pretty obvious due to the holidays. But if there's a trend, a downward or upward trend in sales in weeks out of the year where holidays aren't involved, or there's simply less obvious factors, then this table can assist in pinpointing those upward or downward trends. In conclusion, the Canyon Retail Company has been provided with all of the charts to include the calendar table. And I understand that they will be using the new database for all further operations, and will be using the visualizations to monitor their success and compare their results from the past by region name, vendor ID, vendor name, gear, in addition to product name. And I understand they will also be using the calendar table to track all their success based on week numbers out of the year, and identified trends based on certain weekdays, months, along with all the other helpful columns in that table that was provided to them. With that in mind, thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'll now open it up to questions from my manager as well as anybody from the database team at Canyon Retail Company. Thank you so much.